The distress beacon screamed through the void like a dying animal, its electronic wail cutting through the peaceful hum of the Defiances, bridged like a knife through silk. Captain Jake Morrison had heard thousands of distress calls in his 20 years commanding deep space vessels, but this one was different. This one made his blood run cold. The transmission crackled with static that seemed almost alive, writhing and twisting around words that shouldn't exist, alien syllables that the universal translator struggled to decode. But beneath the technical interference was something far worse, the sound of genuine terror, raw, desperate sobbing that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to something primal in Morrison's chest. He slammed his fist on the console, not in anger, but in frustration. The impact sent ripples through his coffee cup, black liquid sloshing like a miniature storm. "Clean that signal up," he barked at his communications officer. "I want every word crystal clear." Lieutenant Emily Brooks hunched over her station, her fingers dancing across holographic displays with practiced precision. She was good at her job, hell. She was the best officer in the fleet, but even she looked rattled. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the bridge's carefully regulated temperature, and her usually steady hands trembled slightly as she worked. "Captain, I've isolated the source," she called out, her voice tight with something Morrison recognized as barely controlled fear. "That signal's coming from the vortex sector." She paused, swallowing hard. Grid, reference 7-7-Alpha-9. A collective intake of breath swept across the bridge. Morrison felt his own chest tighten. The vortex sector, even saying the name felt like tempting fate. You know how some places on Earth got nicknames? That told you everything you needed to know? Death Valley? Hell's Kitchen? The Bermuda Triangle? Well, the vortex sector was space's version of all three, rolled into one cosmic nightmare. It was a region where dying stars threw their final tantrums, where black holes played gravitational games with anything stupid enough to venture too close, and where radiation storms could strip the paint off a battleship at 1,000 kilometers. No ship has ever survived those radiation storms, Brooks continued, her face pale as printer paper. "It's a graveyard out there, sir. The hegemony lost 3 cruisers trying to map just the outer edges. The Crystalline Collective calls it the place where light goes to die." Morrison had been there once, on the very periphery, during his early days as a lieutenant. He'd watched a meteor, the size of a city bus, get torn apart by competing gravitational forces, its fragments scattered across space like cosmic confetti. The memory still gave him nightmares, but the alien voice kept pleading through the static, and with each word, Morrison felt something inside him harden into resolve. Asterisk, please, ... Anyone? We are dying ... Children aboard. Our shields failing. Can't last much longer ... Asterisk, children. Of course there were children. Commander Marcus Kane stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. Kane had been Morrison's first officer for 8 years, through the Proxima Wars, the Titan Rebellion, and a dozen smaller conflicts that had tested their friendship and their sanity. He was the kind of man who'd follow orders into hell itself, but he wasn't afraid to speak his mind when those orders might be suicidal. "Sir, this is suicide," Kane said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The Defiance is tough, but she's not indestructible. We'll be fried before we reach them." Radiation levels in that sector spiked to over 9,000 rems per hour. "Our shields won't hold for more than minutes." Morrison knew Kane was right. The math was brutal and unforgiving. The vortex sector was a 50 light-year stretch of space that existed in a state of constant apocalypse. Dying red giants periodically erupted in solar flares that could sterilize entire worlds. Neutron stars spun like cosmic lighthouse beacons, their magnetic field strong enough to rip the iron from a man's blood, and somewhere in the center of it all lurked something that sensors couldn't quite identify, a gravitational anomaly that bent space-time like a funhouse mirror. The alien transmission crackled again. Weaker now. Hull breach on deck 7. Losing atmosphere. Please, if anyone can hear this, we have families. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, seeing faces. His crew. Good people who'd signed up for exploration and discovery, not for what amounted to an elaborate form of suicide. 23 souls who trusted him to bring them home. 23 families back on Earth who expected their loved ones to return. But then he opened his eyes and looked around the bridge. Really looked. There was Brooks at communications, still working frantically to boost the signal strength, her jaw set with determination. Engineer Pete Collins at the power management station, already running calculations on how to reroute energy to the shields. Navigator Sarah Kim plotting emergency jump coordinates with mathematical precision. Dr. Rachel Hayes preparing the medical bay for casualties she hoped they'd never have. These weren't just crew members. They were the best of humanity, the kind of people who'd volunteered for deep space service, knowing full well they might never see home again. They'd followed him through the hell of the Proxima Wars, where they'd rescued colonists from a dying world while enemy ships tried to blow them out of space. They'd stood with him during the Titan Rebellion, pulling civilians from burning stations while revolution raged around them. And here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy never quite understood. We're absolutely terrible at leaving people behind. It's like a genetic defect or something. Show us someone in trouble, and our first instinct isn't to calculate odds or consider consequences. Our first instinct is to help. Morrison looked at Kane, his oldest friend and most trusted advisor. Marcus, in all our years together, have I ever asked you to do something truly impossible? Kane's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Every Tuesday, sir, sometimes twice on Sundays. The tension on the bridge cracked slightly, a few nervous chuckles rippling through the crew. But the moment passed quickly as another burst of static reminded them all of the lives hanging in the balance. Plot a course for the vortex, Morrison ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had gotten them through a dozen impossible situations. The bridge fell, silent. Not the comfortable quiet of a well-functioning crew, but the heavy silence of people processing what they'd just heard. Morrison could practically see the mental calculations happening, the odds of survival, the distance to their families, the comfortable retirement that might never come. Then, one by one, his crew moved to their stations. Brooks began calculating communication relays to maintain contact with Fleet Command. Collins started rerouting power systems for maximum shield efficiency. Kim plotted the safest possible route through a region where safety was a relative concept. Hayes prepared medical protocols for radiation exposure that she'd only read about in textbooks, because that's what humans did when faced with impossible odds and certain danger. When logic and self-preservation screamed at them to run the other way, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They ran toward hell when someone needed saving, not because they were fearless, but because they were afraid, and did it anyway. The Defiance's engines roared to life, their blue flames painting the void with defiant light. As they turned toward the vortex sector, Morrison couldn't help but wonder, would they find whoever was calling for help? Or would they simply become another ghost story in the cosmic graveyard? Only one way to find out. Space was trying to kill them, and it was getting creative about it. The Defiance bucked like a wild bronco as another wave of cosmic radiation slammed into a reinforced hull. Morrison gripped his command chair so hard, his knuckles went white, feeling every shudder and groan of his ship as she fought against forces that could vaporize a planet. The bridge lights flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows that made everything look like a scene from Hell's own light show. Warning blared their electronic death songs, while sparks showered from overloaded circuits, like deadly fireworks. The acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that everyone was trying not to swallow. Through the main view screen, Morrison watched in horrified fascination as solar flares reached out from a dying star like the fingers of an angry god, each one carrying enough energy to power Earth for 1,000 years, and they were flying straight into it. Hull integrity at 60%. Engineer Pete Collins shouted over the chaos, his voice nearly drowned out by the ship's tortured groaning. Sweat poured down his face as he wrestled with controls that sparked and hissed with each power surge. "Captain, I'm rerouting everything. I can, but we can't take much more of this. The outer plating is starting to buckle." Morrison could hear it in his engineer's voice, that edge of barely controlled panic that came when a man who understood machinery better than most people understood. Their own families started to doubt whether his beloved ship could hold together. Collins had nursed the Defiance through battles that would have destroyed lesser vessels, but this was different. This wasn't enemy fire or mechanical failure. This was the universe itself declaring war on their little bubble of humanity. The ship lurched violently to starboard as a gravitational anomaly tried to drag them off course. Morrison felt his stomach drop as artificial gravity struggled to compensate, creating that sickening weightless sensation that reminded him why he'd never enjoyed carnival rides as a kid. There, Navigator Tom Wilson pointed at his scope with a trembling finger, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and terror. "Alien vessel, bearing 27 Mark IV. Distance, 8,000 kilometers in closing. But sir, ... she's breaking apart." Morrison's heart hammered as the main screen shifted to show their target. What he saw took his breath away, but not in a good way. The alien ship was magnificent, a work of art that belonged in a museum, not a cosmic shooting gallery. It was all crystalline spires and flowing metal that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, like a living jewel spinning through the void. Beautiful lines curved and twisted in patterns that hurt to look at directly, suggesting an aesthetic sense. So alien that human minds could barely process it. But that beauty was dying. As Morrison watched, another section of the ship's hull peeled away like flower petals in a hurricane, venting atmosphere and debris into the merciless vacuum. The vessel tumbled helplessly, its elegant design working against it. Now all those graceful curves and delicate projections acting like sails in the solar wind, making it impossible to maintain stable flight. "My God," whispered Communications Officer Emily Brooks, her voice filled with awe and horror. "It's like watching a cathedral collapse." Morrison knew what she meant. The alien ship was clearly built for peaceful exploration of garden worlds, places where the worst weather might be a gentle summer storm. Here, in this cosmic meat grinder, were dying stars through their final tantrums. It was as out of place as a butterfly in a blast furnace. "Life signs," Morrison demanded, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Rachel Hayes hunched over her medical sensors, her face grim with concentration. 47 aboard, but the readings are ... strange. Their life signs are fading fast, Captain. Whatever they are, they're dying from radiation exposure that would have killed us 10 minutes ago. Their biology must be incredibly sensitive to this kind of bombardment. Another massive flare erupted from the nearby star, this one larger than the others. Morrison watched it build like a slow-motion explosion, a wall of supercharged particles, racing toward them at a significant fraction of light speed. On his tactical display, the radiation readings spiked so high that the computer briefly displayed an error message, as if it couldn't believe its own sensors. You know that moment in old Western movies, when the hero realizes he's surrounded and there's no way out? That's exactly how Morrison felt as he watched death approaching at 300,000 kilometers per second. The Defiance's shields flared bright red as they absorbed the initial impact, their protective bubble of electromagnetic energy straining against forces that could strip atoms apart. Then yellow, as power systems struggled to maintain coherence. Then shield failure imminent. Commander Kane yelled from his position at the tactical station, his normally calm voice cracking with urgency. "We've got maybe 30 seconds before we're flying naked through a radiation storm. That'll cook us faster than a microwave burrito. Morrison's hands flew over his controls with practiced desperation. Emergency power to shields. All hands, brace for. But before he could finish the order, the universe exploded in white-hot fury as the solar storm hit them head-on. The main lights died instantly, plunging the bridge into emergency illumination that painted everything in hellish red. Morrison felt the artificial gravity fluctuate wildly, his stomach doing somersaults as up and down became meaningless concepts. The deck plates beneath his feet vibrated so violently he could feel it in his bones. A deep thrumming that suggested the ship's structural integrity was being tested beyond all reasonable limits. Through it all, one thought kept hammering at his consciousness. Somewhere out there in that dying alien ship, 47 beings were counting on him to pull off another miracle. Children, the distress call had said. There were children aboard that beautiful, doomed vessel. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally passed, Morrison's ears were ringing, and his vision was spotted with floating afterimages. The bridge looked like a war zone, panels hanging open, cables sparking, and half his crew picking themselves up off the deck. "Status report," he called out, his voice hoarse from breathing superheated air. "Shields are down to 12%, Kane reported, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Hull breaches on decks 4 and 7, but the emergency bulkheads are holding. We're alive, but we won't survive another hit like that." Collins wiped soot from his face, leaving dark streaks across his cheeks. "Engineering reports massive power fluctuations throughout the ship. I can give you maybe 15 minutes at full power before we start losing critical systems." 15 minutes. Morrison looked at the alien ship on his tactical display, still tumbling helplessly, but somehow still intact. 15 minutes to pull off a rescue in conditions that made the surface of Venus look like a tropical vacation. "Wilson, plot an intercept course," he ordered. "Hayes, prepare the medical bay for alien physiology. Brooks, see if you can establish communication with that ship." As his crew scrambled to comply, Morrison couldn't help but ask himself the question that every sane person would ask in this situation. What the hell were they doing out here? But then he remembered the desperation in that alien voice, the mention of children, and the answer came to him with crystal clarity. They were doing what humans had always done, running toward danger when someone needed saving. Even when that someone was from a species they'd never encountered before. The next solar flare was already building on the dying star's surface, promising another dance with oblivion. Time was running out, and Morrison had a choice to make: retreat to safety and let 47 innocent beings die, or push forward into hell itself for the slim chance of pulling off the impossible. He looked around at his crew, battered, scared, but still at their stations, and made his decision. "Take us in." The alien was beautiful and dying, and that combination was breaking Morrison's heart in ways he hadn't expected. Dr. Rachel Hayes worked frantically over the being in sickbay, her hands moving with surgical precision despite the ship's constant shuddering. The creature on the medical table was tall and impossibly graceful, even in its weakened state. Its skin shifted colors like liquid starlight, one moment silver, the next a deep blue that seemed to hold the mysteries of deep space, then flowing into patterns of gold that reminded Morrison of sunset on distant worlds he'd never see. "Vital signs are all over the place," Hayes muttered, adjusting the medical scanner for the third time in as many minutes. "I'm having to guess at their physiology based on what little data we've got. It's like trying to perform surgery while blindfolded and riding a roller coaster." The creature's eyes fluttered open, large, luminous orbs that seemed to contain entire galaxies. When they focused on Morrison, he felt something he'd never experienced before: the weight of an alien intelligence studying him with curiosity, rather than fear. Double quotes, "You, ... saved us," the being whispered, its voice carrying a musical quality that reminded Morrison of wind chimes on a summer evening. The universal translator struggled with the nuances, but the gratitude was unmistakable. "What's your name?" Morrison asked, leaning closer. He'd learned long ago that knowing someone's name made everything more personal, more human. Well, in this case, more whatever species this was. "Valera," she replied, each syllable flowing like water over stones. "Leader of the Seraphim Exploration Fleet, though I fear there is little left to lead." Morrison glanced around the cramped medical bay, now overflowing with survivors from the alien vessel. 23 beings in total. They'd managed to transport that many before the ship's final destruction. 23 out of 47. The math was brutal and unforgiving, but it was better than 0. "Why did you come here?" Morrison asked, genuinely curious. The vortex sector was marked on every star chart with warnings that basically translated to "Here be dragons," in a dozen languages. "Surely your people knew how dangerous this region was." Valera's skin shifted to a deeper blue, what he was beginning to recognize as a sign of sadness or regret. "Same reason you did," she whispered. "To explore, to learn, to push beyond the boundaries that others set for us." Her luminous eyes found his again, and Morrison saw something that transcended species barriers, the spark of curiosity that drove explorers throughout the galaxy. "But we were fools. We thought our technology could protect us from anything the universe might throw at us." Morrison understood that feeling all too well. How many times had humanity's arrogance led them into disasters that should have been foreseeable? The Titan colony disaster. The first Mars terraforming attempt. Hell, half of human history was basically a series of people saying "hold my beer and watch this" before doing something spectacularly dangerous. "Your technology is incredible," Morrison said, trying to offer some comfort. "That ship of yours was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in space." "Beautiful but fragile," Valera replied with what might have been a bitter laugh. "Like so much of what we create. We are a peaceful people, Captain. We have known war only in our ancient history. Our ships are designed for wonder, not survival." On the bed next to Valera lay another, Seraph, younger, smaller, with skin that flickered between pale gold and silver, like a candle flame in a gentle breeze. Morrison didn't need to be a xenobiologist to recognize the equivalent of a child. When he saw one, the young being's breathing was shallow and irregular. Each breath a struggle against the radiation poisoning that was slowly shutting down its alien physiology. Morrison felt rage, building in his chest like a storm gathering. Strength. These weren't warriors who had died in glorious battle. They weren't criminals who had brought their fate upon themselves. They were explorers, scientists, families who had ventured into the unknown with the same spirit that had driven humans to cross oceans and reach for the stars. They were innocent, and they were dying because the universe was a cruel and random place that didn't care about beauty or good intentions. "The young one?" Morrison asked quietly, nodding toward the child. "Family." "My daughter," Valera whispered, her skin shifting to patterns Morrison was beginning to associate with profound grief. "Zarelin. She insisted on coming on this expedition. Said she wanted to see the edge of known space with her own eyes." Her voice broke on a harmonious note that the translator couldn't quite capture. "I should never have allowed it." Morrison's jaw tightened. As a career military officer, he'd seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. But there was something about watching a parent face the loss of a child that hit him harder than any enemy weapon ever could. It was universal, that particular agony. He'd seen it in human faces. And now he was seeing it translated through alien features that somehow made it even more heartbreaking. Dr. Hayes pulled him aside with a gentle but insistent hand on his arm. Her face was grim, painted with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle against time and biology. "Captain, we need to talk," she said quietly, leading him to the corner of the medical bay where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "I can save maybe half of them. Our medical bay wasn't designed for their physiology, and the radiation damage is more severe than anything in our textbooks. I'm basically improvising treatments based on educated guesses and prayer." Morrison looked back at the rows of beds filled with suffering beings whose biology was as foreign to him as his was to them. "What do you need?" "Time, mostly. And equipment we don't have." Hayes ran a hand through her hair, leaving it disheveled. "Their cellular structure is completely different from ours. The radiation isn't just poisoning them, it's literally unraveling their DNA equivalent at the molecular level. It's like trying to fix a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer." Through the medical bay's small viewport, Morrison could see the debris field that had once been the Seraphim ship. Crystalline fragments tumbled through space, still glowing with fading bioluminescence, like dying stars. Beautiful even in destruction, but utterly lifeless. Any hope of evacuating the remaining survivors had died with their vessel. "The young ones are the worst off," Hayes continued. "Their developing physiology makes them more vulnerable to radiation damage. Without specialized treatment, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Morrison looked at Zerilyn, barely conscious on her medical bed, her skin flickering weakly, like a guttering candle. Then he looked at Valera, trying to maintain dignity and hope, despite knowing her daughter was slipping away. "Do whatever it takes," he growled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had gotten them through impossible situations before. "Tear apart every piece of equipment on this ship if you have to. Jury rig, whatever you need. No one else dies today. Not on my watch." Hayes nodded grimly and turned back to her patients, her hands already reaching for instruments that were never designed for alien physiology, but would have to do anyway. Around them, the Defiance continued its desperate flight through hell, her battered hull carrying the hopes of two species as solar flares painted the void with deadly light. But even as Morrison watched his chief medical officer work miracles, with inadequate tools and sheer determination, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against more than just time. Another massive solar storm was building on the dying star's surface, larger than any they'd encountered so far. When it hit, even their reduced shields might not be enough to protect the ship, and if the Defiance died, everyone aboard, human and Seraphim alike, would become just another footnote in the vortex. Sector's long history of consuming the brave and the foolish with equal appetite. The question wasn't whether they could save the aliens anymore. The question was whether any of them would live long enough to make it matter. The Defiance limped into Titan Station 3 days later, like a wounded animal dragging itself home, her hull scarred and smoking from wounds that would take months to heal properly. Morrison stood on the bridge, watching the massive orbital facility grow larger through the view screen, its rotating rings and docking arms a welcome sight after 72 hours of holding his breath. Every time the ship's damaged systems hiccuped, Titan Station was humanity's crown jewel in this sector, a gleaming monument to engineering that served as both trading post and diplomatic hub for a dozen different species. But today, something was different. The usual orderly traffic patterns around the station had been replaced by chaos. Ships from across known space hung in clusters around the docking rings, their crews apparently more interested in watching the Defiance's approach than conducting normal business. Morrison could see everything from sleek Velthari pleasure cruisers to the massive bulk haulers of the Crystalline Collective, all maintaining respectful distances, but clearly present for a reason. "Captain," Communications Officer Brooks called from her station, her voice tight with something between excitement and apprehension. "I'm picking up transmissions from the station." "Sir, they're calling us heroes." Morrison's stomach clenched. Heroes. The word always made him uncomfortable, especially when it came attached to a price tag measured in good people's lives. Word had already spread through the spaceways with the speed that only really shocking news could achieve. The crazy humans who flew into the vortex sector and came back with survivors. Impossible, the reports said. Suicidal, others claimed. Heroic. According to the news feeds that were already spinning the story into something larger than life, the docking procedure took longer than usual, partly because of the Defiance's damaged maneuvering systems, but mostly because station controls seemed to be treating them like visiting royalty. Morrison had requested a standard cargo bay assignment, but found himself being guided to the diplomatic ring instead, where only the most important vessels were allowed to dock. As the airlock cycled and Morrison stepped onto the station's polished deck plates, he was struck by the crowd waiting for them. Dozens of beings from multiple species lined the docking bay, some holding what looked like recording devices, others simply staring with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. At the front of the crowd stood Ambassador Korthak of the Hegemony Council, his massive form impossible to miss even in the diverse gathering. The Hegemony representative was built like a cross between a gorilla and a tank, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms and skin that looked like it had been carved from granite. His 4 arms were crossed in what Morrison had learned was a gesture of deep respect among his people, the equivalent of a human removing their hat in a sacred place. "Captain Morrison," Korthak rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for millions of beings across dozens of star systems. "What you did? No species in known space would attempt such a rescue." Morrison felt the weight of all those eyes on him, the pressure of expectation that came with being labeled a hero when all he felt was tired and hollow. "We lost 6 good people, getting them out," he replied quietly, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the station. The names burned in his memory like brands pressed into his soul. Pete Collins, his engineer, killed when a power coupling exploded during the final escape from the vortex sector. Tom Wilson, his navigator, caught in a radiation burst while maintaining their course through hell itself. Sarah Kim, who'd volunteered to go EVA to repair the shield generators, and never made it back inside. Rachel Hayes, his chief medical officer, who'd died keeping the Seraphim alive during the journey home, her body finally succumbing to radiation exposure she'd absorbed while treating her patients. And 2 others, Lieutenant Marcus Webb and Ensign Diana Price Hood, given their lives in the engine room, manually controlling systems that should have been automated, buying the precious minutes needed to reach safety. 6 names, 6 families back on Earth who would receive official notifications and folded flags. 6 empty chairs at the next crew gathering that would never be filled again. Morrison's jaw tightened as he thought about the media coverage that would inevitably follow. They'd focus on the successful rescue, the diplomatic breakthrough, the triumph of human courage over impossible odds. But they wouldn't spend much time on the 6 body bags in the Defiance's cargo hold, or the nightmares that would haunt the survivors for years to come. "And yet you saved 23 Seraphim," Korthak continued, his granite features showing something that might have been admiration. "Valera speaks of your courage with words that translate poorly into standard, but the meaning is clear. Her people are offering technology exchanges, trade agreements, military alliance. The Seraphim have resources that could benefit humanity for generations." Morrison shook his head, the gesture sharp with something that might have been anger. "We didn't do it for rewards. We did it because they needed help. You know what's funny about being called a hero? People always assume you did something extraordinary for extraordinary reasons. They can't seem to grasp that sometimes you just do what needs doing because nobody else is around to do it." Morrison hadn't flown into the vortex sector because he was brave, or noble, or looking to make history. He'd done it because 47 beings were dying and asking for help, and ignoring that call would have been impossible. No, Korthak's mandibles clicked in what passed for a smile among his species. That is precisely what makes it remarkable. The galaxy has watched, Captain. Other species are asking questions that have never been asked before. How do the humans do what others cannot? Why do they risk everything for strangers they have never met? What drives a species to value unknown lives over their own safety? through the station's massive viewport. Morrison could see more ships arriving, vessels from worlds he'd never visited, representing species he'd only read about in diplomatic briefings. Sleek, Andorian science vessels, the flowing organic curves of Tholian battleships, even a few of the mysterious geometric craft used by the architects, beings so advanced that most species considered them myths, all of them flying a new emblem that made Morrison's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't quite name. It was simple but powerful, a human hand reaching through stylized stars toward another hand different in shape and size, but equally reaching back, the symbol of species helping species, of beings who chose cooperation over isolation. The Galactic Rescue Initiative, Korthak explained, following Morrison's gaze. Representatives from 47 different worlds have pledged ships and crews. They want to know how to be like humans, how to run toward danger instead of away from it. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. 47 worlds. That wasn't just a diplomatic achievement, it was a fundamental shift in how the galaxy thought about mutual aid and cooperation. For centuries, most species had maintained careful boundaries, helping their own kind while viewing others with polite but distant respect. But something about the Vortex Sector rescue had changed that calculus. Maybe it was the sheer impossibility of what the Defiance had accomplished. Maybe it was the fact that humans had asked for nothing in return. Or maybe it was the simple recognition that in a universe full of dangerous dying stars, cosmic storms, hostile aliens, sometimes the only thing standing between survival and extinction was the willingness of strangers to risk everything for people they'd never met. "Captain," a familiar voice called from behind him. Morrison turned to see Valera approaching, her skin shifting through patterns of silver and gold that he'd learned indicated deep gratitude. She moved with careful dignity. Despite the mobility aids, she still needed her recovery from radiation. Poisoning had been remarkable, but incomplete. Beside her walked Zarelyn, her daughter, whose skin now flickered with the bright, quick patterns of youth and health. The young Seraphim had made a full recovery, her developing physiology more resilient than anyone had expected. Seeing her alive and well was the first thing that had made Morrison smile genuinely since leaving the Vortex Sector. "Captain Morrison," Valera said, her wind chime voice carrying formal weight. "I bring word from the Seraphim High Council. We have voted unanimously to establish the Morrison Doctrine, a commitment that no cry for help will go unanswered, regardless of the species in distress or the danger involved." Morrison blinked, taken aback. "The Morrison Doctrine, named for the human who showed us what true courage looks like," Valera replied. 47 worlds have already signed the agreement. More are joining every day." As Morrison stood there, surrounded by beings from across the galaxy who were looking at him like he'd just rewritten the laws of physics, he couldn't help but think about the 6 empty chairs that would greet him when he returned to the Defiance. Heroes, they called his crew, legends in the making. But legends had a funny way of glossing over the price that real people paid for doing the right thing. And Morrison had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning, that somewhere out there in the vast darkness of space, another distress call was already forming. Another impossible rescue was waiting to test just how far this new galactic cooperation could stretch. The question was, how many more good people would die before the galaxy learned that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. 5 years later, Captain Morrison stood before the Galactic Assembly as the first human to address the united species of known space. And he was absolutely terrified. The massive chamber stretched out before him like an amphitheater designed by gods with too much imagination and not enough restraint. Thousands of beings from dozens of worlds filled the crystalline seats, their diverse forms creating a living tapestry of the galaxy's incredible biodiversity. Towering hegemony representatives sat next to delicate seraphim dignitaries, crystalline, entities that communicated through harmonic resonance, shared space with gas-based beings. Contained in elaborate environmental suits, Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium, trying not to think about the fact that his next words would be transmitted to every inhabited world in known space. The weight of history pressed down on him like the gravity of a neutron star, and for a moment he wished he was back in the comfortable danger of a radiation storm instead of facing this sea of expectant faces. The Terran Rescue Corps has answered 400 distress calls, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustics system. The number still amazed him 400 times that his people had charged into impossible situations to pull strangers back from the brink of death. We've saved lives in situations others deemed impossible, but we're not alone anymore. The simple truth of that statement hit him as he spoke it. When the Defiance had first limped out of the vortex sector, humanity had been just another curious species on the galactic stage, notable mostly for coming from a world that other civilizations considered barely habitable. Now, human rescue protocols were taught in military academies across 3 spiral arms. Human medical techniques had revolutionized trauma care for dozens of species, and human philosophy, the crazy idea that strangers were worth dying for, had spread like wildfire through cultures that had spent millennia minding their own business. In the audience, Valera watched with pride that radiated from her shifting skin patterns like warmth from a hearth fire. Her people, the Seraphim, now flew the most advanced medical ships in the galaxy, vessels that combined their elegant biotechnology with human-designed emergency systems capable of functioning in the harshest environments. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison that the same species whose ship had nearly been destroyed by a solar storm now built rescue vessels that could operate inside stellar coronas. The hegemony provided military escort for dangerous missions. Their massive warships serving as mobile fortresses that could establish safe zones in hostile space. The Crystalline Collective contributed their nearly indestructible hull materials and exotic propulsion systems. Even the mysterious architects had emerged from their isolation to offer technology that bent the laws of physics in ways that made impossible rescues merely improbable. Morrison's eyes found other familiar faces in the crowd. Ambassador Corsac, now serving as the Galactic Rescue Initiative's military coordinator, his forearms crossed in that gesture of respect that had become as familiar as a salute. Dr. Sarah Kimnat, the navigator who'd died in the vortex, but her sister who'd joined the Corps, in her memory representing the medical division that had saved thousands of lives across the galaxy. Today marks the 5th anniversary of the vortex rescue. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger as he thought about the journey that had brought them all here. We lost good people that day, but their sacrifice showed the galaxy something important, that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and going anyway. The chamber erupted in approval, a symphony of alien voices raised in unity that would have been impossible to imagine just 5 years ago. Harmonic resonances from crystalline beings mixed with the deep rumbles of hegemony representatives. Seraphim voices chimed like distant music, while a dozen other species added their own unique sounds to the cosmic chorus. It was chaotic and beautiful and utterly alien, yet somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the universe. But Morrison knew that behind all the ceremony and celebration lay a darker truth. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and it was getting more dangerous every year. Stellar phenomena that had been stable for millennia were becoming unpredictable. Ancient alien artifacts were awakening after eons of dormancy, creating hazards that no single species could handle alone. And somewhere in the dark spaces between stars, things were stirring that made even the vortex sector look like a peaceful vacation destination. You know what's funny about being a symbol of hope? People expect you to always have the answers, to always know what to do when the universe decides to throw another impossible situation your way. But Morrison had learned that the secret wasn't having all the answers. It was being willing to try anyway, even when you were pretty sure you were about to fail spectacularly. The formal ceremony continued for another hour, with speeches from representatives of member species and the presentation of various awards that Morrison accepted on behalf of crews who couldn't be there to receive them. Some were off on rescue missions in distant sectors. Others, like Pete Collins and Rachel Hayes, and too many more, were remembered only in the memorial wall that now stood in the Corps' headquarters on Earth. Later, on the observation deck of the assembly station, Morrison found Valera gazing out at the rescue fleet, hundreds of ships from dozens of worlds, all united by a simple principle that had somehow revolutionized galactic civilization. The vessels hung in space like a three-dimensional constellation, their running lights creating patterns that shifted and flowed as ships moved in and out of formation. The sight never failed to take his breath away. Sleek seraphim bioships that pulsed with internal light, massive hegemony battlecruisers bristling with defensive systems, crystalline vessels that looked like living jewels spinning through the void, and scattered throughout the fleet, the familiar angular lines of human ships, not the most advanced or the most beautiful, but somehow serving as the heart that kept everything else beating in rhythm. "Your people started something beautiful," Valera said softly, her skin shifting through patterns that Morrison had learned to recognize as deep contentment mixed with anticipation. Morrison thought of Pete Collins, joking about impossible odds, right up until a power coupling exploded and took him with it. Rachel Hayes, working frantically to save alien lives, while radiation poisoning slowly killed her from the inside. Tom Wilson, maintaining course through hell itself, because someone had to, and he was too stubborn to let anyone else take the risk. "They'd be proud," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Humans have always been stubborn about helping others. Guess we taught the galaxy to be stubborn too." Through the observation deck's massive viewport, Morrison could see the first signs of the fleet's next deployment beginning. Ships were breaking formation, moving into the precise geometric patterns that would allow them to jump simultaneously to their next mission. A stellar collapse in the Kepler Nebula that threatened to destroy 3 inhabited systems. It would be dangerous work, the kind of operation that would have been impossible for any single species to attempt. But they weren't a single species anymore. They were something new, a galactic community built on the radical idea that every life had value, regardless of which world it came from or what form it took. Valera's daughter Zerilyn appeared at her mother's side, now grown into a confident young adult whose skin patterns showed the quick, bright flickers of youth and excitement. She wore the insignia of the Rescue Corps' Exploration Division, the people who went into unknown dangers to map safe routes for the rescue ships that would follow. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the same wind chime quality as her mother's, but with an edge of eagerness that made Morrison smile despite himself. "The advanced scouts have confirmed 3 more distress beacons in unexplored space. Unknown species, unknown dangers. The Council is asking for volunteers." Morrison looked out at the rescue fleet, then at the young seraphim, who represented everything they'd fought to protect and nurture. Somewhere out there in the dark, people were calling for help. Strangers who needed saving. Another impossible mission that would test the limits of what courage and cooperation could accomplish. "Tell the Council they'll have volunteers," he said, "more than they know what to do with." As if summoned by his words, the ships of the Galactic Rescue Armada began their synchronized jump, disappearing in flashes of exotic energy that painted the void with rainbow fire. They were heading toward another impossible rescue, another chance to prove that in a cold universe full of dying stars and hostile forces, compassion could still burn bright as any stellar furnace.